she was hunting for a man in England from 2013 onwards, when her marriage had crashed. And she came from nothing, not a very successful actress. She had no money, she had no future after the Suits, and suddenly she's an international star.
When clips began circulating online claiming that royal biographer Tom Bower had gone on live television and pointed straight at official birth records while dissecting Meghan Markle's biography, the reaction was instant and explosive. The story was framed as something bigger than gossip. Documentation versus narrative, records versus branding, fixed dates versus curated storytelling. In a media ecosystem that rewards shock, the wording was irresistible. He showed the proof. He exposed the timeline. He forced the truth into the open. But the moment's real significance, when separated from viral exaggeration, was not the dramatic promise of a secret age reveal. It was the way the entire debate exposed how easily personal facts become battlegrounds when fame, image management, and public trust collide. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that gets buried under all the noise. Meghan Markle's birth date has never been mysterious in official terms. Most mainstream biographical references consistently cite the same date, and the broader documented sequence of her education and career fits within that established timeline. The controversy does not survive on a lack of records. It survives on a gap between what records imply, ordinary linear chronology, and how celebrity storytelling often presents that chronology, compressed, polished, emotionally shaped for maximum narrative impact. What viral clips and heated commentary tried to sell as a real-age bombshell was, at its core, a more subtle but more revealing question. Not whether the official record exists, but how public perception can be nudged away from the record through selective framing. This is why the claim that Bower pointed to official documents hits such a nerve, even when the internet can't produce a clean primary source trail. The image of someone on live television gesturing at paperwork triggers a psychological shortcut. Viewers associate documents with finality. In a culture saturated with curated interviews and carefully staged vulnerability, the idea of raw, unedited records feels like the ultimate authority. It suggests that the era of narrative control is over and the era of accountability has begun. That is the emotional hook, and it is powerful enough to spread faster than verification. But the most important part of the story, what matters more than the dramatic packaging, is the principle underneath it. Records do not bend to branding. Birth registrations, school enrollment dates, graduation years, early professional credits, and public databases are not designed to support an arc. They exist to record administrative reality. They sit fixed in time, resistant to aesthetic polishing. And when someone, whether Bower himself or commentators borrowing his name, recenters a conversation around records, it forces a comparison that celebrity culture prefers to avoid. The difference between a life lived and a life marketed. The debate about age and celebrity culture is rarely about a number. It is about what the number implies. Age influences how careers are packaged, how struggles are framed, how reinvention is sold, and how audiences are invited to empathize. In entertainment, youth is often treated as a currency, and late-blooming success is often turned into a heroic narrative. A public figure can be presented as a constantly emerging newcomer, even when the actual journey was steady and incremental. The public is not necessarily being lied to in a cartoonish sense. It is being guided toward a story structure that feels inspiring, dramatic, and emotionally coherent. That guidance becomes controversial when it begins to blur chronology in ways that invite distrust. This is why the alleged Bower moment landed so sharply across social platforms. It wasn't that he supposedly revealed hidden files. It was the suggestion that he stripped away the glow of public relations biography and replaced it with something stubborn and unglamorous: timelines, dates, milestones, the kind of basic chronology that, once pointed out, can make a glossy narrative feel suspicious even if the underlying facts were never actually secret. That is the paradox of modern fame. The public is surrounded by information, yet the narrative can still drift away from that information if enough outlets repeat the polished version without checking the primary sequence. And that drift is not accidental. Celebrity profiles, especially sympathetic ones, often rely on press kits, prior interviews, and ready-made bios that are designed for storytelling, not for documentary rigor. A journalist might inherit details from earlier pieces. A lifestyle feature might highlight one era and skip another. A promotional biography might emphasize themes, reinvention, resilience, outsider status, while smoothing away awkward chronological bumps that interrupt the emotional flow. Over time, the public doesn't absorb a timeline, it absorbs an impression. The story becomes less what happened when, and more what it felt like. That is how a biography becomes a brand. So when a critic or investigator frames the discussion as documentation versus narrative, it feels like an attack on more than facts. It feels like an attack on the brand's foundation. In Meghan's case, authenticity has been a central part of her public messaging. Her speeches, interviews, and media projects frequently emphasize lived experience, truth-telling, and the right to own your story. When a figure positions herself as a voice for honesty and transparency, the public becomes more sensitive to any hint of selective emphasis. Even small gaps, innocent, explainable, normal gaps, can be interpreted as strategic because the brand itself raises the expectation of full coherence. That is why the reaction to the alleged broadcast became so polarized so quickly. Supporters framed the attack as petty, invasive, and rooted in a broader culture of scrutinizing women. They argued that fixation on age is a classic tool used to diminish female public figures, regardless of their achievements. Critics framed the scrutiny as overdue accountability, insisting that public credibility depends on consistency, and that image management becomes a problem when it masquerades as moral authority. Two camps looked at the same premise and saw two different realities: misogyny versus accountability, harassment versus due diligence. But beneath the emotional war, something else was happening. Something that explains why these controversies keep returning. The internet is a machine that rewards certainty, not nuance. It rewards dramatic framing, not careful distinctions. So even if the original claim was merely that records exist and narratives drift, the viral version becomes exposed, caught, proved, lied. That escalation happens automatically. A cautious question becomes a confident accusation because confident accusations travel farther. And once the accusation spreads, the public starts demanding a response on the internet's terms. Instant, emotional, definitive. This is where the so-called records-based claim becomes strategically dangerous. If the public is told that official documents were pointed to, then silence feels like surrender, even when silence might simply be a refusal to legitimize a nonsensical cycle. Outrage at the messenger doesn't address the underlying premise. Attacking motives doesn't dissolve the perception that the narrative drifted. So the conversation shifts from "what do the records show?" to "why is this person obsessed?" That shift might protect a brand emotionally, but it does not reassure a skeptical audience intellectually. In fact, it often does the opposite. It makes neutral observers feel that substance is being avoided. And yet, it is also true that a public figure is not obligated to treat every viral claim as worthy of engagement. One of the biggest traps of modern fame is that responding to a rumor can amplify it. Refuting a fringe narrative gives it oxygen. It signals that the claim has enough weight to deserve a response, which encourages more claims. Legal strategy often recommends restraint. Child protection recommends restraint. Reputation management sometimes recommends letting a story die. The problem is that the internet does not reward restraint. It rewards reaction. That creates a permanent tension between what is wise and what is demanded. The deeper issue, then, is not simply Meghan's age. It is the collision between two systems. One system is bureaucratic reality, records, timelines, administrative facts. The other system is narrative reality, branding, emotional storytelling, curated identity. Most public figures live at the intersection of those systems. They have a documented life and a marketed life. The marketed life is not always false. It is selective. It is arranged in a way that makes sense to audiences. It highlights certain themes and fades others into the background. In a healthy media culture, journalists keep those systems aligned by checking the marketed story against primary records. In an unhealthy media culture, repetition replaces verification and narrative drift becomes inevitable. That is why the alleged live TV clip functioned like a spark. It symbolized a return to first principles. If there is a question, go back to the record. If there is a claim, anchor it in dates. If a biography feels too perfectly shaped, test it against chronology. The public responded not because a secret was uncovered, but because they recognized the structure of the modern fame game. They recognized how easily a story can be made to feel true, even when it is loosely anchored to actual sequence. This also exposes a discomforting reality about the media institutions that helped create the polished impression in the first place. Celebrity journalism often operates on access. Access requires cooperation. Cooperation often requires gentleness. Over time, gentleness becomes habit. The biography becomes a shared script. Outlets repeat what other outlets said because it is convenient, because it is safe, because it is already accepted. That is how subtle inconsistencies can survive for years without being challenged. Then, when someone finally recenters records, it feels like an ambush, even though the records were always there. And the records, importantly, do not need to be dramatic to be true. The most grounded version of Meghan's story is also the least sensational. Steady progress, education, early work, professional persistence, a long path to high visibility. That story is less viral than the myth of sudden emergence. It is less clickable than the story of reinvention. It is less emotionally explosive than the story of a brand new outsider who arrived fully formed. But it is more realistic, and realism often loses in the attention economy. This is also why the controversy, once triggered, tends to spread into broader distrust. When audiences feel that a basic biographical detail has been managed, they begin reassessing other claims through a more skeptical lens. Even truthful statements can be doubted once trust is shaken. The public begins asking, if this was framed selectively, what else was framed selectively? That may be unfair, but it is a predictable psychological response. Credibility is not a pile of separate facts. It is a single structure. Once one beam looks unstable, people start testing the entire building. At the same time, it is crucial to maintain intellectual discipline. Selective emphasis is not the same as fabrication. A compressed timeline in a lifestyle article is not proof of conspiracy. An interview that highlights one hardship more than another is not necessarily deception. Human beings tell different versions of their story depending on context, audience, and purpose. That is normal. The controversy becomes combustible when the public decides that different emphasis equals different reality. In a polarized environment, that decision often depends less on evidence than on feelings about the person involved. So what did this viral moment really expose? Not a hidden age, not a secret birth year, not a mysterious absence of official record. It exposed something more structural: how celebrity narratives are manufactured, circulated, and protected, how media repetition creates truth-like impressions, and how quickly a records-based framing can destabilize a carefully curated arc. If the internet truly saw a Bauer takedown, the takedown wasn't of documents. It was of the habit of letting narrative float away from chronology without being challenged. The live television framing, real or exaggerated, also matters because of how it functions symbolically. Live formats reduce the opportunity for editorial cushioning. There is less room for carefully crafted adjectives and smoother story arcs. The message becomes blunt. Here are the dates. Here is the sequence. Compare them to how the story has been told. That bluntness resonates in an era where audiences are tired of polished confessionals and branded vulnerability. People want anchors, facts that do not bend. And once the public tastes the satisfaction of an anchor, they become less tolerant of storytelling that feels too perfectly engineered. This moment also highlights an uncomfortable reality for public figures who build identity around transparency. Transparency creates a higher standard. When a figure positions herself as a moral voice, speaking about truth, authenticity, and lived experience, audiences become more alert to any sign of narrative control. That is not entirely fair, but it is real. The public has a sharper reaction not because the biographical detail is significant, but because the brand made truth a central theme. In such cases, even minor narrative drift can be weaponized as a sign of hypocrisy. The outcome of the controversy will not be determined by outrage. It will be determined by how the public's attention is managed. If the story is allowed to harden into exposed without corrective nuance, it will stick as a cultural impression, regardless of evidence. If it is addressed with records-based clarity, it can be stabilized. But records-based clarity is difficult because it requires patience, precision, and a willingness to engage in the unglamorous work of chronology. The internet does not reward that work. It rewards drama. This is why silence becomes such a strategic gamble. Silence can starve a rumor, but it can also allow a perception to crystallize. Outrage can energize supporters, but it can also deepen skepticism among neutral observers. Attacking the critic can feel satisfying, but it does not answer the underlying question. Are the records consistent with the public narrative as it has been presented? If a claim is truly about documentation, The only answer that settles it is documentation. Not vibes. Not indignation. Not motive debates. Documentation. In the end, the so-called real age debate says less about Meghan Markle as a human being and more about the ecosystem of modern fame. It reveals how biography becomes product, how timelines become flexible for storytelling, how repetition becomes mistaken for verification, and how quickly public trust shifts when records are recentered. It also reveals something about audiences. Many people do not want more stories. They want certainty. They want the comfort of fixed facts in a world where everything feels curated. And that is what made the moment, whether it was exactly as viral posts claimed or not, feel so significant. It did not introduce a new reality. It reasserted an old one. It reminded audiences that records do not evolve with branding strategies. They do not respond to criticism. They do not adjust to marketability. They remain where they were placed, fixed in time. When those records are pulled back into the spotlight, the distance between image and chronology becomes visible. And once visible, it becomes much harder to ask the public to unsee it. That ultimately is the true exposure, not of a secret number, but of a method. A method in which the story is shaped to fit a preferred arc, and the arc becomes so widely repeated that it begins to feel like truth. Then, when the arc is tested against the hard edges of chronology, the reaction is not calm correction, it is cultural conflict. The brand fights back, the critics escalate, the internet amplifies. And in the middle of it all sits the simplest reality that never changed. The official record is steady, and the narrative is what moves.